Hi class. So we're still doing movements that we can find at synovial joints. It's taken me a long time to do these. Normally we do all this in class, so this is kind of hard to do it remotely, but we're going to try. So make sure you have your movements of synovial joints paper in front of you, so as we go through these you can kind of glance at it too. So we've already gone through flexion, extension, ab and adduction, and circumduction. Now we're going to discuss rotational movements. So what is a rotational movement? It is a circular movement rotating around a fixed point. What does that mean? We'll get to that, and once you see it, it'll make more sense. Now, the joints that you need to know that have rotational movement, it's going to be C1, C2, the Atlantoaxial joint, Atlas axis, Atlantoaxial joint, the proximal radioulnar joint, you'll see this again, and of course the shoulder and the hip joint. So let's start with rotation of the Atlantoaxial joint. Make sure you understand why it's called Atlantoaxial joint. Atlas axis, C1, C2. So here we have C1 is rotating around the dens of C2. And there's a ligament that is holding this dens within this C1. So as this rotates around here, we're going to get a rotational movement around this axis right here. And this allows your head to rotate from side to side movement, and you're able to shake your head and say no. Here it is from the back side, showing you C1, C2, turning your head, rotating it from side to side. I have a little YouTube video that I found. I'll show it to you. This is a pretty easy motion to figure out, but let me just show it to you. Rotational movement, C1, C2. So pretty easy movement, right? So now we're going to come to the rotational movement that we see at the proximal radioulnar joint, the radius and the ulna. This is the proximal radial joint. You just learned these bones. Here's the head of the radius, and it is articulating with that radial notch of the ulna. And these two bones are joined together by a ligament. Remember, ligaments connect bone to bone. And this head of the radius, the way it's designed, is just going to be rotating in this radial notch. And that ability to rotate in this radial notch of the ulna is going to give us an action that we call supination and pronation. So let's see what is going on. So if you are in the supination, if this is right here, this is your arm. If you put out your right arm right in front of you, bend your elbow, i.e. flex your elbow, and you know that your radius is the lateral bone, right? And the ulna is your medial bone. Now, when you turn, and go ahead and turn your forearm over, when you do that motion, when you turn that forearm over, this is called pronation. So what happens? There's the head of the radius is rotating right up here, and the radius is now crossing over the ulna. So go ahead and look at your hand and try to figure out what's going on when you see that. So this is pronation. When you go back to this position, this is supination. Supination, you can hold a can of soup in your hand. In pronation, you are turning over. So let's see. I got this little video. This is kind of cool. So just look at what's happening at this proximal radioulnar joint. The head of the radius is going to be rotating right with the ulna at the radial notch. Here is the hand is in supination. The radius is right here, and then in pronation it's going to go over. Pronation, easy weasy, supination, back. And that action, look at what's going on up here. It's just rotation of the head of the radius in that radial notch of the ulna. So kind of easy to see that. I just wanted to show you that in a real person.
Hi there, welcome to my video lesson on pronation versus supination of the forearm. So to begin, when you hold your forearm in a horizontally flexed position, such as this position I'm showing you, a supinated position is where the palm is open and facing up towards the sky. In reverse, if I rotate my forearm so my palm faces downward, this is known as pronation. This is important not only for students that are in anatomy courses or medical professionals, but for those people who need to identify people like nurses, doctors, who need to understand the difference between the two positions. And also it makes reading papers and textbooks a lot easier to kind of know the anatomical definitions or the anatomical positions. So again, this is supination versus pronation.
So pretty self-explanatory, but supination and pronation of the forearm, that's just something you have to know. You have to understand it. You will see it a lot if you're going into any medical field. So just practice that. Supination, palms up, pronation, palms down. Okay, now we're coming to rotational movements found at the shoulder and hip joint. Now these can be a little tricky, but we'll go through them and hopefully you'll figure it out. We have something called internal, aka medial rotation, and external, aka lateral rotation. Now here, what you need to understand, what is rotating? It's the head of the humerus or the femur. They're rotating within their sockets, either the glenoid fossa of the humerus or the acetabulum of the femur, and they're rotating along their long axis. What does that mean? So if you have internal rotation, this is moving the anterior surface of the upper arm or the thigh, either the humerus or the femur, towards the midline. And this will make more sense once we go through these actions. But basically, if you are having internal rotation, that ball, either the head of the humerus or the femur, that ball is rotating in the glenoid fossa or the acetabulum, and that humerus or femur is turning towards the midline. As opposed to external or lateral rotation, here the head of the humerus or femur is rotating outwardly, laterally, and the surface of the humerus or the femur is turning away from the midline. Big description of what it's doing. It makes just more sense if you see pictures and you can figure it out, and I'll show you how it works. So here, if we just say, we'll just say this is our starting point. Let me scoot this over. So here's our starting point. Neutral. And in this picture, we actually have the elbow is flexed, the elbow is bent. So if you do this yourself, have your right arm sticking out just like this picture, and keep your elbow in toward, keep your elbow in towards your torso, and then just swing your arm out. Just swing that humerus out. That is going to give you external rotation. Now, if you start in this position here, if you start in this position and then you do the same thing, keep your elbow towards your torso and swing it in towards the midline of your body, that is internal rotation. And what is rotating, remember, is here, this is the shoulder, this is the head of the humerus in that glenoid fossa. So now here's some other ones I want you to do. I want you to be in they call this the neutral position, just like this. Have your hands in front of you, just like she does, and go ahead and pull them apart, just like she does right here. That is external rotation. So go back to neutral, pull apart. That is external rotation. The action is happening with the head of the humerus in that glenoid fossa. Same thing with this. If you were at the gym and you were doing this, if you start in a neutral position and you go over to this direction, that would be internal rotation. And then when you pull it back out, this is going to be external rotation. Internal rotation, external rotation. Pretty easy to see on the shoulder. Now, when we get to the hip, this is a little bit harder to visualize. So hip, we're talking about the head of the femur and that acetabulum. So for internal rotation, medial rotation, remember the action is happening up in here. Here's the long axis of the femur. The femur is, here's neutral, here's the patella. Patella's right in the middle. And now the femur is rotating. So now we have the anterior surface of the femur is now facing more medially in. Internal rotation, aka medial rotation. As opposed to external rotation, now the femur is facing the more laterally. We've laterally rotation of the hip joint. So the action is happening here. A little bit harder on the hip. Now, even gets more complicated when you're looking at patients, because normally you're going to be checking their internal and external rotation either sitting down or laying down. So if you're checking it while they're sitting down, this is what internal rotation is going to look like. So here is the femur. It's being rotated inward. The leg actually comes out, but the head of the long axis of the femur is going inward, as opposed to external rotation. Now the femur is, the long axis is going more towards the lateral side. And I'll show you some more pictures of this because I know this can be confusing. Internal rotation, external rotation. Don't look at the leg. You're looking at what is happening with the long axis of the femur here. Same thing if your patient is in the supine position. This is going to be internal rotation. It's rotating, the long axis of the femur is rotating towards the midline. External rotation, remember the action is happening at the head of the femur and the acetabulum. Now the femur, the long axis of the femur is more laterally located. Internal rotation, external rotation. So this makes more sense. If you can get yourself in this position, if you can do this and try to do that, and then you look at what's happening at your hip joint right here. This is external rotation. If you are sitting down, that is external rotation right there. So get yourself in that position and look at your hip, and while you're getting yourself in that position, what is happening is you are getting that external rotation at the hip joint. Here is the patient in the supine position. Same thing, the external rotation of the hip joint. This is what you see. Kind of looks like this, right? So this is external rotation of that hip. Here is going to be showing you internal rotation. Internal rotation. This is what you would see sitting down. Here's the neutral position right here. When you internally rotate it, that long axis of the femur is going towards the midline. So, internal rotation. Now I have a little video. I just wanted to show you something so you can kind of see people actually doing this action.
Hey, what's up? It's Coach E here from Precision Movement, and today we're going to talk about hip internal rotation. So hip internal rotation is that when the femur rotates that way, okay? External rotation is that way, internal rotation is that way. In terms of an injury perspective, hip internal rotation is really important for those of you who play sports like soccer, basketball, jiu-jitsu, any type of sport that requires you to run and cut. Internal rotation is going to save your knees, because if you don't have internal rotation and you cut like this, all the force is going to go through your knees a lot quicker, and the knee is not designed to take very strong rotational forces. That's for the hip, and that's more for the foot, ankle. So if we're missing hip internal rotation, all of that force has to go somewhere, goes through the knee, and that's when you can get torn meniscus, ACLs, PCLs, those nasty injuries of the knee that take a long time to heal. So let's avoid all that.
Today I'm going to show you the difference between internal rotation of the hip and external rotation of the hip. We'll go over the muscles that control those actions in the body. So first we'll talk about external rotation of the hip. It is performed by the external rotator muscles of the hip. So namely your glutes, you have your gluteus maximus, minimus, medius, and your piriformis muscle, all assist in rotating the hip back. So as a simple exercise, you can stand on your left leg, pick up your right leg, and then just squeeze your glutes. And you'll notice that just by squeezing them, it causes my foot to move out to the side because my hip is being pulled externally. So you can try it on both sides. You're not even really trying to externally rotate your hip at this point, but just by squeezing those muscles, you'll get the idea that they cause the hips to move out, to externally rotate. Now, the internal rotators of the hip are your inner thigh muscles and also part of your hip flexor. So these muscles pull the hip inward. So you can do the same exercise, just shift your weight over to the left leg, pick your right leg up, and then just start to internally rotate your leg. Now, with this one, you're actually going to have to try to pull the leg inward because these muscles aren't quite as strong as your glutes. But still, you'll feel that muscle contract when you pull the hip in. So rotating the hip inward, internal rotation, and then externally rotate. The hip is rotating outward.
Well, I hope those videos helped you somewhat. Internal rotation of the hip is a little bit harder to visualize than external rotation. And what you hopefully got out of watching that too is how you need to protect that knee. The knee joint is very vulnerable. So as we learn the knee joint more, you'll understand that too. So let's go on to movements of the ankle. So these are actions found in the ankle. We call them dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So if we start in this 0 position, which is basically your foot is flat on the floor, and you dorsiflex, you are lifting the toes and the dorsum. Remember, this is the dorsum of your foot. You're moving it up towards the tibia. You're pulling it up. That's like if you were standing on your heels, walking on your heels, that would be dorsiflexion. Now, plantar flexion, you are pointing your toes down, pointing the toes down, like you were walking on your toes, standing on your toes. So this is plantar flexion. This is dorsiflexion. So if you look at this, you should be able to figure out what is happening at the ankle joint here. Here the toes are pointed. Here the toes are pointed, standing on their toes. This is what? This is plantar flexion, as opposed to, here you are standing on your heels. This is dorsiflexion. If you were in the neutral position here, if the foot was flat, and then you pulled the dorsum of the foot up towards the tibia, this would be dorsiflexion. So walking on your heels, dorsiflexion. But when you are normally just walking, day-to-day walking, and you are starting off flat-footed, and then you start walking heel-toe. If you ever heard to walk heel-toe, heel, what is this? This is dorsiflexion. And then once you push off on your toes, this is plantar flexion. So make sure you get those in your head. Which one is dorsiflexion? Which one is plantar flexion? When you're out walking, just go heel toe, figure out dorsi and plantar flexion. The last one we're going to do on this video is foot inversion and eversion. So in inversion, what happens in your feet is when your foot is turned so the sole of the foot, the bottom of your foot, is facing inwards. If you have your feet right now flat right in front of you and you turn the soles inward, that is going to be inversion. Put your feet back flat on the ground, and when you turn the sole of your feet outward, it's harder to do, that is going to be eversion. So let me show you some other pictures. Well, here's a little video. So you can see inversion and eversion. So let's see if this person gets back to neutral. This is going to be eversion. Inversion. Inversion, the sole of the foot is pointing in. Eversion, the sole of the foot is pointing out. Now, if you were going to roll your ankle, this is most likely what would happen, right? Usually if you're having some kind of ankle injury, it is going to be an inversion injury. You're rolling your ankle out. So here, get this picture a little bit bigger. Here is inversion. Do this on yourself. Inversion, the soles of your feet are pointing inward. If you were walking or running and you did this action, you rolled your ankle out, your foot out. This is an inversion action right here that's happening. And this is what you're going to see in patients a lot, an inversion ankle injury. What happens when you have an inversion ankle injury? So here is an inversion of your ankle and foot. The sole of the foot is pointed inward. Where is all the stress going? The stress is going to the lateral part of your ankle. All the force is going laterally. Do that on yourself. Go ahead and do inversion on yourself. All the stress is lateral. So this is what an ankle sprain would look like. This is the lateral part of your ankle. You're going to get swelling over here and some bruising on the lateral side of your ankle and foot. Inversion ankle injuries, pretty common. So that's it for this video. I will have one more video on the last actions, not too many left.